Hi, I'm Benton Stokes.
And I'm Elane O'Rourke.
And this is Cocktail Theology.
Welcome to Coffee Theology.
Right? I know. It's not often that we record in the morning.
I just want to assure our listeners that we're recording in the morning, but we are drinking coffee.
We are.
In case you were concerned that we start out our morning with a Negroni or a Manhattan, I want to assure you that this isn't alcoholic theology. It's just, it's really sort of, what is the liquid at the time of day we're
Pretty
doing
much.
this? I mean, that's really what it comes down to, because we're both pretty much liquid people. Of
Oh,
one
yeah.
kind or another, you know?
Yeah, for sure.
So it's coffee theology this morning. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm okay. I am excited in some weird way about this being our 26th episode.
Isn't that something?
It really is.
Yeah.
In less than a year. We've been pretty good about this.
Yeah, we have.
So 26 episodes. We've talked about everything from cheesy bears to Gulf streams to Jesus.
Mm-hmm. We've covered a lot.
We've covered a lot. Are we done talking about things?
Oh, I don't think we'll ever be done talking about things. I can't imagine a time when we would be done talking about things.
It's pretty tough. So here we are doing number 26, and this is our last one for this season, as I recall.
It is. We'll be taking a little break, and then we'll be back with more episodes in 2019.
And we are looking for topics that you want us to cover, from the very, very tiny to the very, very large. Anything you'd like us to either talk about or try to create as a cocktail or as a coffee thing, we'd love to hear from you. And then during the winter time, School for Seekers gets a little quiet, although we do an Advent thing here in Hermitage, Tennessee in the evenings. And I'll do a set of Advent devotionals that you can receive if you go over to our website, schoolforseekers.com, and sign up for our mailing list. You'll hear about that, and you can sign up for that. I'm actually considering doing, I don't know if I told you this, I'm considering doing the Bible 101, Reading the Bible as If It Matters, online.
Love that idea.
So, again, if you sign up for our mailing list, you will hear about that. I think that would actually be a really good thing.
I do too.
And then it's Christmas, and then it's the New Year, and then we do this again.
That's right.
Yes. Yay!
And then in the interim, too, we should say that you're going to be working on your book.
I am going to be working on
over
my
the
book.
next couple months. I am putting out music. Got a single coming out this week, and then I have other surprises down the pike. We're going to be very busy doing our creative things, which is going to be great fun, too.
It is great fun. We like to do Cocktail Theology live.
We do.
Although I'm not sure how you would do it unlive. But we would like to do it live in your home, or at your church, or in your restaurant, or at your bar. We would love to do it in front of a live audience.
Yes.
For you and your friends. It's really fun, and
really
it's
fun.
Great to have the energy in the room and be able to answer questions and do that kind of thing. So if you are interested in bringing us to you for that, or for retreats, or for any of the stuff we do, because we do a lot of different things, please contact us at info@schoolforseekers.com. That would be lovely, because we would love to come and see your people.
We
and
would.
Get to know your people.
We certainly would.
So today we're talking about people, sort of.
We are talking about people, sort of.
We're talking about, what are we talking about when we're talking about patriotism?
Yes.
This is the third in our series of what are we talking about when we're talking about fill in the blank.
Mm-hmm. And
I think you were suggesting that we do some more of these in our next season, in season 2.
I think so. And again, if you guys have ideas about that or suggestions for that, we'd like to know. But yeah, I think we'll do more of these.
So what are we talking about when we talk about patriotism? And this all started when we were in a little cafe in a little town in Kentucky.
We were up in Hopkinsville, Kentucky recently. We were having lunch in a little diner downtown, small town Kentucky. They were playing the local country radio station in their diner. And while we were enjoying our lunch, at straight up noon, a recording of the national anthem starts to play.
I was befuddled.
And Elane was befuddled. And the observation that you made was how nothing in the diner stopped. Nobody stopped their conversations. The servers didn't stop serving. The cook didn't stop cooking. And we just looked at each other like, what are we supposed to be doing right now? The national anthem's playing. And you're looking around and nobody's doing anything different. And so it was puzzling. The whole experience was a little bit puzzling because there are a lot of Americans. They have the idea that when the national anthem plays or is being performed or being sung, that you should stop what you're doing. If you're wearing a hat or a cap, you should take it off. You should put your hand over your heart. If there's a flag around, you should find it and look at it. And there should be reverence for the anthem, which is a symbol of the country. So actually reverence for America by way of reverence for the anthem. And so here we are in little town in the heartland, and that's not at all what's happening.
So it caused us to think about patriotism, and that the idea of paying attention during the anthem or standing or doing all of these things is supposed to be a sign of patriotism. That if one does that, one is patriotic. If one doesn't do that, one is not patriotic.
Right.
And so we started talking about patriotism and began to wonder what it is we're actually talking about when we think we're talking about patriotism.
Mm-hmm.
Because we have some very clearly conflicting behaviors about it, whether or not our simple ideas conflict. So, for example, whoever decided that the national anthem should play at noon, instead of, say, what I'm used to, which would be, bomb sirens, testing.
Right.
But whoever decided that the national anthem should play at noon must have experienced it as a patriotic gesture.
Yeah.
And so then the question becomes, well, why is it patriotic? And if it is patriotic, what is our response supposed to be, as you brought it? And then if we don't have that response to someone's patriotic gesture, does that make us unpatriotic? And what's the value of patriotism to begin with? So those are kind of questions I think that we've been toying with since this happened. Mm-hmm. They've certainly puzzled me for a long time. As I said, folks, that when the music came on, I was a bit befuddled because I heard it come on and I sort of looked shocked. I guess I probably looked a little deer in the headlights at Benton and didn't know what we were supposed to be doing at the moment. But as I've told him, I don't get patriotism. I don't get it. And I think it's connected to my general lack of group connection. Mm-hmm. So in the same way that you can be excited about a particular corps in drum corps, I don't have much of that. So I think my failure to feel that way is a general sense of who I am rather than about patriotism per se.
Belonging to a tribe.
Belonging to a tribe is just not a big thing for me. So the question then is, what is it we're talking about when we're talking about patriotism? And when we were talking about this a little bit last night, what germinated from that is that patriotism is, reverence is a great word, is reverence or respect or attachment to whatever it is, wherever it is that you consider to be your home, your people, your land, your values, whatever that thing is.
Right.
So, for example, somebody who flies the American flag experiences the United States as home, as the people from whom they come, or something. Right. If you fly the Confederate flag, you experience the South that way.
Yes.
And not necessarily that you don't experience the U.S., but your particular connection is to the South.
Right.
And if you fly the Ecuadorian flag, then it's Ecuador. But I liked that we were looking at definitions of this, of patriotism this morning, and that homeland language I thought was really helpful for me in understanding what patriotism is supposed to be about.
What it's supposed to be.
That sense of home. So when you say you're going home, what's home for you?
I think some elements of home go with me anywhere that I go. I think my relationship with God is part of home for me.
Okay.
I think a lot of times when I think about home, I think about things like dinner with my family. I think about growing up in Nashville. I've lived in this part of the country my entire life. There is a connection to this area for me. And along with that, I think, there's when you really feel at home or belong somewhere, you can brag about it and tout all of its virtues to everybody that doesn't live there or isn't a part of that. And you really only complain about it to the other folks that live here and the other people that have lived here for a long time and consider this home too. You will always defend it to those that are outside of it.
Ah,
you know
okay.
What I mean?
Okay, sure.
But getting back to your question, I think
that's a great point.
I think home is where my family is, where my friends are, where my faith is. And while, again, I have a certain connection to this part of the country, I've lived here my whole life, I don't believe it's necessary for me to be here to feel at home.
So the feeling of being at home could go somewhere else.
Yes.
If you were somewhere else and you were casually talking about home, you would probably mean this area.
I would be
roughly.
referring to this area.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. I really like that. Brag about it to outsiders and critique it to insiders.
Mm-hmm.
I think it really sets up that sense that we have of insider-outsider when it comes to home.
Yeah.
Which is why patriotism has that insider-outsider aspect.
It absolutely does.
So the first time I went to Europe, I went as an exchange student when I was 16. But then I went back when I was 19. I had a straw cowboy type hat with me, literally for sun and such. And I don't know why. I think I had that because if it got destroyed, I didn't care.
Yeah.
But then I had a t-shirt that said, I heart LA, which is where I was from. It would never have occurred to me to put a USA sticker or anything on anything. Like, that wouldn't have occurred to me. Home for me was California, not the US. So I think in that sense I've got that. It's not the Confederacy, but it is specific.
There's still a
to
regional,
California.
right.
There's a really strong regional distinction, right? So while I was traveling, I got a lot of people in Europe asking me about the gun problem in the U.S. This is, a very long time ago.
Oh, wow.
Right?
Yeah.
And, I mean, literally, kids would come up to me and ask to see my gun.
Oh, my gosh.
19 years old, traveling in Europe, backpacking by myself.
That's insane.
Well, that was how we were seen. And I remember trying to say, okay, not everybody in the U.S. has guns, and definitely not everybody in California has guns, because, there's such a division between the coast in California and the inland, all that stuff. But becoming very conscious while I was there of my split brain between where I was from and how different those things might be conceived to be. There was a period of time while I was there that the United States was at odds with Europe to some degree. And it was not really safe to be an American by yourself in certain parts of Europe that I was visiting. So I would either say that I was from Canada or from California.
Oh, yeah.
And both of those were fine.
Both of those were okay. That's funny.
Isn't that funny? But I think that sense of those distinctions between region, nation, all of that have to do then with what we consider home, what we consider the insiders, outsiders, how we feel allowed to critique, not critique, that kind of thing.
Sure.
That critique and defend piece is really useful. So maybe part of what we're doing when we're talking about patriotism is suggesting that if one is patriotic, one defends one's country to outsiders and then critiques it with insiders. Are we allowed to do that at this point?
I think so, but I also think that the climate in the country right now is such that vocal Americans that are prone to critique.
You're looking at me, aren't you?
No, actually I'm not. Vocal Americans that are prone to critiquing the country are right now pretty focused on critiquing people outside their particular micro group.
Okay.
And when I say micro group, the micro group can still be thousands and even 1 million or more people.
Sure.
But I think that there's a lot of vitriol right now that these groups have, that they're aiming toward each other. And that's not to say that, like, for instance, if you identify in a particular political party, that there isn't squabbling within the party, or there isn't jockeying for position, or there isn't discord about what the real issues are, or how to combat those. That kind of stuff is going on in different parts of the country in different ways. The climate right now is not such that you would just, like, go over to your neighbor and just say, hey, what do you think about what's going on in America right now? I mean, unless you knew that individual, because you just don't know what you're walking into right now, you know? And I don't think that was always the case. I think there was a time in America where there were a lot of front porch conversations about what's going on in the country. It was safer to have a more open dialogue about things than it seems to be right now. It seems like right now you kind of have to know where somebody stands on the particular issue before you step into a conversation with them. Even on, you know, social media or anywhere right now, it's not entirely safe to be an American critiquing America.
I hear two different things in what you're saying. One is that idea that there was a time when your next door neighbor, for example, was more likely to share roughly the same views that you do.
Or at least you could have a civil conversation.
Or at least you could have a civil conversation. Mm-hmm. How much of that do you think is because we are less homogeneous than we used to be? Or do you think it's about civility?
I think I've mentioned on the podcast before that I feel like we've lost the ability to have civil and open discourse right now in our country. We just have. People are not respectful when they disagree. I feel like that's a big part of it, was that there was a time when it was commonplace for neighbors to have civil conversations about things. They can disagree about whether there should be a traffic light at the corner, or they could disagree about, you know, how much taxes they should be paying toward the schools, or they could disagree about, you know, the governor's stance on something. Or you could get national and you could say, well, the president this, or the president that, or the Congress this. And people, it just seemed like conversations were much more open, and people were more open to looking at issues from the other side. Right now it feels very, very personal. If we're having a conversation about immigration and my point of view isn't the same as yours, then I might see you as a threat. And that creates a different idea of home. If home includes people that look or think or whatever like you, then that circle gets tighter and tighter and tighter.
Yes.
As people voice opinions that differ from your own.
Yes.
And I feel like that's where we are right now. So it's very difficult to have, you know, open conversations about these hot button topics with people, particularly people you don't know. I would never approach a stranger at the grocery store and say, so what do you think about gun control? I mean, unless I had the Zoom and I was like interviewing them for a podcast, being man on the street. But to just go up to somebody and ask that, you might get punched.
At least.
And then, you know, people on both sides of these issues will claim patriot status. Will say, well, I'm a better American than you because this or that or whatever. And so you have these groups trying to say, we own America, or we own the name of American, or we are good Americans because, and you're a terrible American because you think that.
So it sounds like, from that perspective, when we're talking about patriotism, what we're really talking about is how we identify our friends and foes. To be able to have civil conversation about anything, the people involved have to assume that they're in the same boat, going roughly the same direction, and that they're going to be in that boat together for a very long time.
Yeah.
Now, one may choose to have civil conversation regardless of whether you're in the same boat with somebody, but that seems to be the way that we learn how to be civil with each other. If you're right, I'm not sure you are, but if you're right that there was a time when one could be relatively assured of civil conversation, I think that was probably true within separate communities within the United States. but not necessarily across communities. For example, think about the uppity black people who decide to march for civil rights.
Right.
That sense that there was a new us and them, no matter what side you're on this, a new us and them says that whoever us was didn't think them was ever part of us. Because suddenly they're really a them.
Yeah.
So
I think you're right about that.
So I think that race, class, things like that have always been dividing lines of civil discourse.
Sure.
But what seems to be happening in our conversation about patriotism is we seem very, very, very desperate to keep shrinking the us, really litmus testing the us, bigger and bigger thems. It's a kind of jingoism, a kind of, I don't even know what you'd call it. I'm sure sociologists have a good word for it, but there's something about wanting to distinguish immediately whether you are part of us or you are part of them. And so the discourse becomes uncivil really quickly.
Yeah.
Because as soon as you're a them, we don't have to be civil to each other because we're not going to be in the same boat. We don't have to live together.
Right.
So I think what's happening with the conversation about patriotism these days is that we're using the language of patriotism as a way of distinguishing us and them.
Yeah.
So for example, we've talked before about how I think that African Americans and others kneeling during the national anthem, quietly, respectfully kneeling, is much more patriotic than, for example, having the Star-Spangled Banner be background music to your lunch. Because it sets aside the time, shows that it matters. Even if you're critiquing, it matters.
Right.
Rather than it just being, could be Neil Diamond playing in the background.
Sure.
So I think that the fact that you consider the Star-Spangled Banner important, truly important, is more of a sign of patriotism than giving it some sort of mythical heroic status. Okay? So if we say, for example, that Kaepernick is unpatriotic because he knelt during the national anthem, we're not actually saying anything about the kneeling. What we're saying is he's not one of us.
Exactly.
He's not really an American. I'm really an American because I like the national anthem to play at noon while I'm eating my sandwich. He's not really an American because he doesn't. That's what we're doing with it, I think, these days.
Yeah.
And I think that those distinctions, if they used to be between nations or among nations, are just getting more and more micro. Because it's not. We are all Americans. We are in the same boat. We are going to rise and fall together. So we need to be able to converse about this. Instead, it is, there are 5 million separate pots of Americans on this land. We all have different ideas, and only one of us can win.
Yeah.
One pot out of the 5 million is allowed to claim real American. That's what we're fighting over. I don't think we're talking about patriotism at all. I think that's the problem. We're calling it patriotism.
We're calling it patriotism, sure.
But I don't think we're talking about patriotism at all. It used to be, after the McCarthy era, and just before Vietnam and then after Vietnam, to call something un-American was really rare and heavy. It's like, McCarthyism used that language of un-American because it was so powerful.
Right.
I think people think of each other as un-American all the time now.
Yeah.
For trivia.
Oh, right.
You put sriracha on your hot dog, that's un-American. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and so much of that, again, goes back to my idea of America. My idea of home is what's really America and what's really home. And if you don't fit into that,
right,
then you're automatically, if not already un-American, definitely prone to being un-American.
Right.
Because you don't ascribe to my point of view.
Right.
Or my list of views that I think are
right.
truly and purely American.
I think the other thing that has happened, and I could talk about identity politics and individualism and stuff for hours on this, but the other thing that's happened is that where groups used to be the measure, individuals are now the measure.
Yeah, right.
So if I have X view on the color blue, and you disagree with me about the color blue, you must be wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You must be.
Yeah.
There's no, oh look, a broader view of the color blue.
Mm-hmm.
It is simply, you disagree with me on the color blue. I am the authority on the color blue.
Mm-hmm.
At least in my little kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And if you step into my kingdom, you need to agree with me on the color blue. So we've gotten this sense that each individual person determines the truth about whatever the thing is. And if you share a close enough truth that we can ignore that it might be different, then we can ally ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't think as a nation, I feel confident that as a nation, we could not name one thing that we think is absolutely fundamental to what it means to be American. I mean, we might be able to limit it to 40 or 50, but I don't think we could come up with one. Or even agree on a set of 10 that one might draw from.
Yeah.
So if we can't agree on what it means to be XYZ, American, a lover of blue, whatever the thing is, then our patriotism is always going to be this very micro-home view.
Absolutely.
I really think that at this point, what we're talking about when we're talking about patriotism is me, which is very different than us.
And I feel like we're talking at it as if our idea of America is always under siege.
Right.
It's not aspirational.
At all.
It's not a kind conversation. It's not being wistful about American values or things that the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence point out as values that we want to ascribe to. Mm-hmm. It's not about that right now. Mm-hmm. It's like people are talking at each other, yelling really at each other because they feel threatened that their point of view, which they view as the right American point of view, is under siege.
Yeah. How did we become such a self-centered, defensive group of people? I mean, really?
I don't know. We used to aim that kind of talk at other countries, other principalities, other forms of government, other, not American. But now we're so quick to splinter America into all these other groups by so narrowly defining what it means to be an American in my house, my neighborhood.
It's like if we call ourselves American, we're not allowed to disagree. Like, if you and I are both Americans, that means we agree on everything. And when we disagree, that calls into question whether one of us is actually an American. Exactly. Rather than our all being part of the same house, and inside the house, people bicker, and they disagree.
Right.
Getting back to the NFL protests, if in fact the people who were antagonized by the protests had actually wanted to change what was going on, they in fact didn't have to change society at all. They just had to ignore the protests were happening. Because eventually, people stopped doing things when they're being ignored. Right. Now, I'm not saying it would have been the right thing to do. Please hear me.
Right.
But instead, they saw it as one of us has to win. Mm-hmm. One of us is not American, and I guarantee it's you. I'm going to get a beer during the national anthem, but that's more American than kneeling in protest. And that's the thing that is so striking about these conversations about patriotism. The assumption is that we aren't all actually Americans.
Yeah.
And while I think that has largely been true from ethnic minority point of view, there's always been that aspect, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the number of second, third, fourth generation people I know who are asked where they're from, as if they aren't from Fresno, right? Like the idea that we would deport people who were born here because their parents were illegal completely tweaks the notion of home.
It does.
If you were born here and you grew up here, this is home.
This is home.
Now, that may not be where your grandparents were from, but this is home.
Yeah.
So I think that for ethnic minorities, immigrants, folks who weren't in primary social and monetary power, there's always been that sense of any minute you could be classified as other into that other category. Mm-hmm. This may be the first time period where white folk are doing massive categorization in that, and broad scope categorization based on micro differences.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Right? Like the North and the South have been at odds since there was a North and a South. Mm-hmm. That would actually be an interesting conversation about all of this. So I know you don't identify as a Southerner in that kind of, sense. But it would be interesting to know whether, picking a random time, in the 1950s, Southerners felt like they were other to other Americans, or whether they felt like everybody was part of America, but they also were Southerners.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Whether it was a dual identity or whether it was a sole identity. Because that would actually tell us a lot about what patriotism has meant, and whether in fact this is different, or whether we're just more aware of it now. And people are ruder now, because they are definitely ruder.
Oh, yeah.
There's no question about that. I've been in a discussion on one of the media, as you know, about some of the things that are going on in our government these days. And the person with whom I have been accidentally, I really didn't intend to be arguing with this person, but actually, I haven't been arguing much, but everybody's been arguing on my behalf with this person.
Right, which happens.
Which happens, which is always kind of funny. It's like, no, really? Okay, fine, carry on. The person clearly identifies as an American of a particular stripe and sees that identification as fundamental to who he is. Mm-hmm. He also identifies as a Christian. Somehow that's not as fundamental. Mm. And I think that that's not unusual. I don't think that's a rare thing. But anyway, he was saying something about what identity was and what it meant. And he was talking particularly about gender identity, but he could have been talking about any kind. It doesn't matter for this conversation. And he was claiming what identity was and how it was based and all of that. And I responded that I identify as a Jesus follower. My primary identity is in my relationship to God and others because of God. Mm-hmm. The rest is happenstance of birth or happenstance of school or happenstance. The only thing I've specifically chosen and continue to keep choosing, really, are my relationships.
Right.
So I identify with God, I identify with you, I identify with my husband, I identify with my kid, all those things, because I keep choosing to be in those relationships. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean that people outside of those relationships are other. And I guess what I'm getting at with that is that the need to other others is so strong right now. And to identify with the nation, if you will, is just a fast way of doing that. It doesn't require actually being in a relationship. Mm-hmm. If I'm in a relationship with my neighbor and we disagree on something, for me, where it starts is we're in a relationship and I'm going to try and figure that out. Okay. Rather than we disagree on something, that will determine whether we're in a relationship.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Makes
I realize I'm kind of going around and around on this.
No, that makes a whole lot of sense.
And that's the thing. I think that we have lost the fact that I have trouble saying we when talking about the people outside this room says how far we've come.
Yeah, it does.
From a sense that we are in the same boat.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when I interviewed Doug Padgett of Vote Common Good way back now in the podcast series, we were talking about that the sense of the common good and acting for the common good is so long gone. Then, you know, what they're trying to do on their tour is to revive the notion of the common good and voting for the common good rather than voting for some weird idea you have about some abstract thing. Mm-hmm. That's it. We just don't have a sense that there's a common good. We don't have a sense that floating all the boats is a good thing.
Yeah.
We want to sink some boats. So there are fewer boats that have to float.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And so that we know that the people that are still floating are with us.
Right. Because if we're all still floating, some of those people might not be with us. They just happen to be floating.
Right.
God, can I torture a metaphor any farther than I have? But it's that. I want to be in the same boat.
Yeah, me too.
With folks. And particularly with folks I disagree with. Mm-hmm. Because I learn from them.
Yes.
I mean, I truly do. If they're behaving in a sane way, I can learn from them. Mm-hmm. And sane doesn't require much from my perspective. You know? I mean, for me, that notion of sanity is really just not constantly attacking verbally or physically.
Yeah.
Really, the people I'm connected with. You can attack my ideas. I'm happy to talk about ideas. You can attack my ideas all you want. Mm-hmm. You attack my people, that's a problem.
That's different. That's really different.
Is it really that we have so much to lose? I mean, does my next door neighbor, I'm assuming my antagonistic next door neighbor, who's not antagonistic, I'm making this up, but does my next door neighbor really feel like she has so much to lose if I turn out to be right about popcorn? Or whatever?
It seems that way. It really does seem that way. It seems very, very life or death.
That's it. So much of what has been going on over the last X number of years, and I don't care how you parse it, although I could argue about it, is this tightening down rather than loosening up.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think if America's about anything, it's about, you know, those first lines. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights.
Yeah.
To me, that is all we're about. We aren't about capitalism, although we have that economic system. We're not about race, although we have racial issues. We're not about God. We're not about any of those things. It's inalienable rights.
It's that.
That's what the country, the nation, is about.
Yeah.
The other things happen to be true, but that's what it's about. Inalienable rights. We cannot take rights away. That's the notion.
That's the notion.
Of us.
Mm-hmm.
Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. But patriotism these days seems to mean taking away rights to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness from people who cannot otherwise fight back.
That's what it seems to me too.
It breaks my heart.
It's horrible.
If we aren't about values that are life-giving, if we aren't about values that suggest that we are more connected than disconnected, if we aren't about values that embrace, that say, you know, there really is enough. We might call ourselves American. I don't think we can call ourselves Christ followers. Because if following Jesus is about anything, it's about life-giving. It's about embracing. It's about, it doesn't matter where you come from. None of that matters. It's about, how can I serve you?
Yeah.
How can I embrace you?
Right.
How can we share in this community? That's what it's about.
Yeah.
I think I'm willing to be called an American if I can have those values.
Oh, I am too.
And if I'm not a patriot, because my values include really listening to the other person's point of view, because my values include feeding hungry children regardless of the color of their skin, because my values include that transgender people are allowed to be transgender and that I don't actually have any say about it, as if I could define what it means in the first place.
Right.
You know?
Right.
As if I could, as somebody who isn't transgender, as if I could define it in the first place. If to be an American means to have values that don't allow for openness and warmth and hope and sharing, I'm not a patriot.
Me neither.
I'd like to think that patriotism in this nation had something to do with those values and not just about whether I got mine today. What am I talking about when I'm talking about patriotism? I'm talking about that.
Think, what's your idea of patriotism? What's your experience of America these days? We would love to hear from you. You can find us always at schoolforseekers.com, cocktailtheology.com. You can also find us on the socials where there are interesting conversations going on sometimes, on Elane's page especially.
But on Benton's page, we're talking about music.
Music.
So that's just so much more
music
fun.
All the time. Yeah.
So much more fun. But we would love to hear from you. And while we're on this hiatus, please be in contact with us. Let us know what we can talk about that might be useful to your conversations in your home.
Absolutely. These things can be really hard to talk about.
They're really hard to talk about. So if we can help with conversation, we are more than happy to do that.
Yeah.
And sign up for our mailing list, info@schoolforseekers.com, so you know what we're doing, and that would include things we're doing with Cocktail Theology. We mentioned that as well. And if you'd like to support us, if you'd like us to come back next year and do more of this, please go to patreon.com, patreon.com/Cocktail Theology, and make a monthly pledge.
Please.
That would be really helpful to us.
Yes.
Thank you so much for listening. We are always, always, always grateful for you.
We are.
So, thank you, and have a wonderful rest of the day after your coffee.
I know. We still got like a lot of day left
That's
today.
weird.
That's so weird. We usually
It's like, time for bed. But maybe we can just go take a nap.
Be game for a nap.
Okay, nap time.
That's great.
Bye.
Bye.